Hi, this is Ellen from the Chili Dog, and today I'd like to show you how to do a provisional crochet cast-on. Provisional cast-ons are temporary cast-ons. They're used when you want to work some of your knitting in one direction and later pick up live stitches from the cast-on edge and work in the opposite direction. They're often used for knitting hems or decorative edges on your garments or for scarves that are worked from the center down to the ends. Today I'm using a provisional cast-on to start a pair of Beekeeper socks. These socks are worked from the toe up. So I'm going to start by casting on half my stitches here across the top of the toe. Then I'm going to use German short row shaping to knit the toe of my sock. First the top of the toe, and then back down the bottom of the toe, and I'll end right about here. At that point, I'll be able to pick up the live stitches from this provisional cast-on edge and continue working the sock in the round for the rest of the foot. So let's cast on. To do a provisional cast on, in addition to your yarn and your knitting needles, you'll also need a piece of smooth waste yarn and a crochet hook that's at least a ½ millimeter larger than your knitting needles. Your waste yarn should be wool-free so it can easily be removed later and doesn't accidentally felt into your knitting. So the first thing you need to do is make a crochet chain that's about 10 stitches longer than the number of stitches you need to cast on. I need to cast on 32 stitches, so my chain is going to be about 42 stitches long. To make a crochet chain, you're going to need to start with a slip knot. Next, insert your crochet hook through the loop, and then you can pull on your working yarn and that tightens the loop up around your crochet hook. Next, you'll want to weave the working yarn over the fingers on your left hand so that the yarn goes over your index and your ring finger and under your pinky and middle finger, and this helps you tension the yarn as you work. Hold the crochet hook in your right hand, bring the hook underneath the yarn, hook the yarn, and pull it through the loop. And if your loop gets too big here, all you have to do is pull on the working yarn and it'll tighten things up a bit. So that's our first stitch. Now let's continue on. Bring the hook under the yarn, hook the yarn, and pull it through. Under the yarn, hook the yarn, and pull it through. Under the yarn, hook the yarn, and pull it through. And you would just continue on in this manner until you had crochet chained as many stitches as you need for your cast on, plus about 10 extra. When the chain is your desired length, trim the yarn, leaving a tail that's a couple inches long. And then you can use your crochet hook to pull this last strand through the last stitch. Just pull it through. And then we're going to want to tie a small knot in that tail. And that knot is going to remind us later that this is the end of the yarn we're going to want to pull to remove the crochet chain. So there's my little knot. Let's take a close look at our crochet chain. If you look closely, one side of the chain almost looks like a column of stockinette stitches with V-shaped stitches stacked on top of each other. If we turn the chain over to the other side, it looks more like a dashed line running straight down the center of the chain. That dashed side is the side we'll be using as we pick up our stitches. So you want to place the chain with the dashed side up so that the knotted end is over here to the right, and we'll be picking up our stitches from right to left. Now we're ready to start casting on our stitches. So to begin, you take your knitting needle and slip it underneath one of these dashes. And it doesn't have to be all the way at the end. That's why we chained a couple extra stitches when we were doing the crochet part of this cast on. So slide your needle underneath one of the dashes, and then you're going to take your working yarn here and loop it around your knitting needle. And then you're carefully going to pull that back through underneath the dash so that you have a loop around your knitting needle. And before we go on, let's just take a minute and make sure that that stitch is mounted properly on the needle. And what I mean by that is that the front leg of the stitch that's here at the front of the needle should be attached to the yarn tail. And if you look at the leg on the other side of the stitch on the back of the needle, that should be attached to the working yarn. And also, your yarn tail doesn't need to be excessively long, just a few inches so that you can weave it in later. And if you need to shorten it at all, you can just pull on the working yarn and it'll shorten up the tail. So let's continue picking up stitches. So we're just going to insert the knitting needle underneath one of the dashes, take our working yarn, wrap it knitwise around the needle, and then carefully pull it through underneath the dash. Insert the knitting needle underneath the dash, wrap the yarn knitwise, and carefully pull it through. Insert the needle under a dash, wrap the yarn knitwise, and pull it through. And as you're doing this, just be careful that your stitches are here on the base of the needle and that you don't have them all wedged up on the tip, otherwise they will end up being too tight later. So just continue picking up all your stitches until they're all cast on. After all your stitches are cast on, you can turn your work over and then begin knitting. Your first row that you work can be either a right side row or a wrong side row. It will depend on the pattern you're using. For my pattern, I'm going to start with a wrong side row. I'm going to knit the toe of my sock, and then I'll show you how to remove the waste yarn and pick up the live stitches on the other side. I've finished knitting the toe of my sock, and here's the cast on edge that's going to go right across the top of the foot of my sock. So I knit the top of the toe and then the bottom of the toe in rows, and now I'm ready to work the rest of the foot of the sock in rounds. So I need to remove this waste yarn and transfer the live stitches onto a knitting needle. So again, I'm going to be working from right to left as I pick up my stitches, and I need to make sure to start with the end that we tied the little knot in at the beginning, because that's what I can pull to unravel the crochet chain. The first thing I need to do is to pull this knotted tail back through the last stitch of the chain. So you can use your knitting needle to go through under that first dash, kind of pull up, and you may even need to use the knitting needle to open up that first stitch a little bit so that you can go ahead and just pull the yarn tail through. So some knitters prefer to just pull this tail and unravel the whole chain at once and then transfer their stitches onto knitting needles. I am a little bit nervous about doing that, so I prefer to go slow, one stitch at a time. So now you can begin to unravel the crochet chain. So you're gently going to pull it out one stitch at a time until you get to your first cast on stitch. And you'll notice here that as I approach that first cast on stitch, that your yarn tail kind of drops free. And that is perfectly normal. You don't have to do anything with that yarn tail. So as you can see right here, I'll try to pull it in close, there's my first stitch that I cast on. And it's still got the crochet chain through it. So what I like to do is to carefully take the yarn tail and that little crocheted loop and pinch them together, kind of pull them up just so that I can open up the stitch that is knit as much as I can. And then I'm going to insert my knitting needle from back to front through that stitch. And now that it's on my knitting needle, I can pull out one crochet chain. Now it's time to pick up the next stitch. So again, I'm going to pinch that little loop along with my yarn tail and kind of pull it up to open up the knit stitch, go through the stitch from the back to the front, get it through onto my knitting needle, and then pull out the chain. And again, pinch the loop and the yarn tail, pull it up to just open up that stitch, insert your knitting needle from the back to the front, through the stitch, and then pull out the chain. And continue on across your work. I have a couple notes I'd like to share before I pull out all of my stitches and get them onto my knitting needles. One question you might have as you're seeing this is, do you always have to pick up your stitches from a provisional crochet chain on the wrong side of your work? And the answer is no. I'm picking up from the wrong side because the first row of stitches that I knit was a wrong side row. If instead the first row of stitches was a right side row, then I'd be picking up from the right side. Either way, you always want to pick up your stitches from right to left across the chain. Another question you might have is when you're picking up the stitches through these loops, do you always have to insert your knitting needle from the back of the stitch to the front of the stitch? And again, the answer is no. So if you pick up from the front to the back, and a lot of people find it easier to pick up from the front to the back, here's what happens. It's the same process that you'd pinch the yarn tail and the crochet chain and kind of open up your stitch. And some people prefer to go through from the front to the back to pick it up. And then pull out that chain. And that's perfectly fine. You can see it's on the needle okay. The only thing is that when you pick up from front to back, instead of going back to front through the stitch, your stitch is actually going to be mounted backwards on your knitting needle. And let me show you what I mean here. Let's open up this stitch a little bit. And you can see that the leading edge of the stitch is actually going over the back of the needle here, and the trailing edge is actually at the front of the needle. So if you were to knit that as it is now, you'd end up and your stitch would be twisted. So if you pick up your stitches from front to back, eventually you're going to have to go through and turn them around on your knitting needle so they're mounted properly. So now you can see that this leading edge comes over the front of the needle, and then the trailing edge of the stitch goes over the back of the needle. As you approach the end of the chain, you just want to be careful as you get to these last couple of stitches, because that last stitch is a little different than the rest. So let me pick up one more and show you what I mean here. So I'm going to pick up the second to last stitch, just like I've been doing, and then pull out the chain. And then when I get to this last stitch, it doesn't quite look like the other stitches. And let me pull it in close. It looks like it's just been twisted. The stitch has been twisted around the crocheted yarn. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, be careful that this waste yarn doesn't twist around while you're working. So it's probably good to work on a table or something where you can kind of hold your yarn and your knitting in position. So you'll also notice that this is really, really tight, this tiny little stitch. So I want to insert my knitting needle parallel to the waste yarn and be pointing from right to left through that stitch. So I'm going to very carefully here try to open it up. And it may take a little bit of wiggling just because it's so tight around that waste yarn. And of course, it's always a little bit trickier to do when it's on camera. So there, I made it through the yarn. So you want to be parallel to your waste yarn and go through that little loop. And then if I just pulled on the waste yarn at this point, it would unravel this, but it's still caught here. So for that last stitch, once it's on your needle, you can just go ahead and pull the remainder of the chain and pull from left to right, and it pulls the waste yarn all the way out. Now all of my provisionally cast on stitches are transferred onto my knitting needles, and I'm ready to continue working the rest of my sock in the round. So I hope you enjoyed learning how to do the provisional crochet cast on. If you'd like to try it in a project, head over to the shop section of thechillydog.com and look for the Beekeeper socks pattern. Until next time, happy knitting!